What even is Resident Evil? Because throughout the years, it's changed a whole lot. It's shifted from survival horror to action horror, to Mario Party, and from third person to first person to hey, you choose person.
Hey, over here.
But how did all of this happen? How do we even get to this point? Well, to answer that question, we're gonna have to go way back to the 90s. This is the history of Resident Evil. Back in the early 90s, horror was kind of going through an identity crisis. Most games that were categorized as such felt more like point-and-click adventures than what we know today to be survival horror. There were titles like The Seventh Guest that loosely embodied the horror genre, but mostly in the sense that their stories were about ghosts and ghouls.
Oh, this isn't real!
One of the bigger games to come out of this era was Alone in the Dark, a game that, while campy and somewhat goofy looking, still laid the groundwork for what would eventually become known as survival horror. And while it was a critical and commercial success, eventually spawning a few sequels and reboots, it wasn't quite the horror game that most people were looking for. That's when game designer Shinji Mikami was entrusted with developing a new game for Capcom, one that would be loosely based off their own NES game, Sweet Home. It was quite a departure from Mikami's past projects. His resume consisted primarily of Disney licensed games, but he was up to the task and got to work on what we now know today as
Resident Evil.
When Resident Evil was released, it changed everything. The pre-rendered environments aided in giving the game a truly creepy feel, and the inventory system limited the items you could pick up, forcing the players to be selective with what they held. But it was the control scheme that pushed it into new territory. Players would rotate their character with left and right, and move them forward by pressing up, regardless of where they were on the screen. What this did was slow the character's movements down, as it was impossible to just bolt out of a room at the first sight of trouble. Players would find themselves struggling to maneuver their character during these tense moments, making zombie confrontations all the more stressful. The game also had a sense of dread that made you feel vulnerable at every turn. The moments between each room, separated by the creepiest loading screen you'll ever encounter, were incredibly tense, as you were never quite sure what kind of monster was waiting behind the door. There could be zombies like these zombie dogs, bees, snakes, or even these guys. And while, okay, the dialogue might be more famous than the actual game itself,
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
it was all part of the game's charm. The B-movie horror aspect felt very reminiscent of a George A. Romero script, in which it was very clearly inspired by. And the campiness of the game would eventually become a defining characteristic of the franchise. After all, it was the first game to ever coin survival horror. Capcom had set a precedent with Resident Evil, so they quickly got to work on the follow-up. This new game featured a pair of new protagonists, more numerous and grotesque zombies, as well as a more modern setting. It was shaping up to be a bigger, faster, and more intense Resident Evil than ever before, but a little over a year into its development, it ran into a roadblock. And despite being almost finished, disagreements between the director and the producer of the game caused Capcom to completely scrap the project and rebuild it from the ground up. This unfinished game, dubbed Resident Evil 1.5, was never actually released to the public, but what rose out of its ashes was something spectacular. In 1998, Resident Evil 2 was released, building upon everything that fans loved from the first game with better graphics, music, and environments. The game gave players a much more cinematic experience, which aided in making it even scarier than the first. In addition to the technical advancements, the plot went much deeper into the mythos of Resident Evil. Going beyond the single mansion setting, the game now took place in Raccoon City itself, with your character given a much bigger environment to explore and get lost in. This is when Resident Evil started investing more time into its backstory, as you slowly learned about the virus, where it came from, and ultimately how it affected and infected the residents of the city. Resident Evil 2 also introduced what Capcom called the zapping system, which gave the player different storylines and puzzles for each character. Regardless of the troubled development, Resident Evil 2 was a success. It went on to become the best-selling single-platform game for the franchise, with almost 5 million copies selling on the PlayStation. With the incredible success of Resident Evil 2, Capcom was on an upward trajectory, becoming the flagship developer for the survival horror genre. Countless other horror game franchises were launched in the wake of Resident Evil's first few games, including Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, and hey, even Capcom's own Dino Crisis. But the company knew they couldn't stagnate, and kept the momentum going by releasing Resident Evil 3 Nemesis in 1999, which was only a year after Resident Evil 2. This game had a much shorter development cycle than its predecessors, as Capcom was attempting to work on multiple Resident Evil projects at the same time, but with the arrival of the PS2 just a mere year and a half away, they all knew that time was running out. A small team that had been working on a spin-off game suddenly found themselves tasked with making Capcom's third mainline Resident Evil title. But the game stayed fairly true to the Resident Evil name, giving the players control of Jill Valentine, and they were tasked with, once again, exploring Raccoon City. The biggest change, however, was the addition of Nemesis, the daunting, unstoppable zombie with a rocket launcher that stalks you through the entire game. Nemesis brought in a slightly different terror, one that was a lot more action-oriented. It was the dawn of what is now considered the Stalker system in modern Resident Evil games. During these encounters, you could choose to hold your ground and fight, or simply just run away. It made the game more frantic, and with the inclusion of a 180 turn and dodge move, it ever so slightly hinted at the new direction that the series would eventually go in. But we're not quite there yet. A year after Nemesis, Resident Evil Code Veronica was released, and while it didn't possess a number at the end of the title, it was by all means still part of the mainline Resident Evil story. Hell, the developers even consider it to be the true sequel to Resident Evil 2. Code Veronica was the first Resident Evil game to be released on a system not named PlayStation. The power of the Dreamcast allowed the game to have actual real-time environments. That means no more pre-rendered stuff. Even though it's widely considered to be good, the one thing it didn't do was really boldly move the series forward in any new direction. Yeah, you had the new features that were introduced in Resident Evil 3, but the game felt nearly identical to it in terms of mechanics, which really isn't surprising considering that they were in development at the same time. Code Veronica may not have been the groundbreaking sequel that people were expecting it to be, but it did have a few things to call its own. Namely, it featured some of the most ridiculous cutscenes to date, and it was a precursor to how ludicrous the series would get in its future games. After the success of Code Veronica, Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami began the arduous task of remaking the original game. He was convinced that the first Resident Evil hadn't aged well. He felt a remake would allow new fans to really appreciate it more, so production began in early 2001, and over the course of the next year, magic happened. It transformed into a thing of beauty, one that pushed the GameCube to its limits with real-time lighting, motion-captured character movements, and even particle effects. The graphical redesign was what made the game. It gave players the terrifying atmosphere that the original game promised, with no compromises. It had only been 6 years and one console generation since the original Resident Evil, but the leap in graphical quality was astronomical. But despite all the improvements made to the game and how much effort was put into making it one of the best Resident Evil experiences to date, there was one thing that Capcom just couldn't control: poor sales. The remake was a GameCube exclusive, and while it sold 1.4 million copies worldwide, that was well below Capcom's expectations, and the following game, Resident Evil 0, sold just as poorly. Despite it being made in the very same vein as Remake, Zero was criticized for not doing enough to advance the franchise. Critics were turned off by the clunky controls and outdated mechanics, and this was kind of a wake-up call for Capcom. They knew that people wanted something different. They knew that it needed to be more than just scary. They needed to make the game fun. If they wanted their next title to be a success, they'd really have to shake things up a bit.
I received special training via a secret organization working under the direct control of the president.
So the pressure was on for the next major Resident Evil installment. It didn't have to only be a success, but it had to evolve the series and therefore the genre. Several directors would step in to take the lead on pushing the series to unknown heights, and this led to experimentation, including one version of the game that was more action-oriented, and even dabbled with a protagonist that had superhuman abilities. While that version didn't come to fruition as a Resident Evil game, it did, however, release as something else entirely.
Let's rock, baby.
Devil May Cry. After realizing fast-paced action and superhuman powers may not be the best fit for Resident Evil, Capcom went back to the drawing board. What followed was a series of prototypes and experiments, iterating on camera placement, combat, and even enemies. These early versions saw Leon Kennedy not fighting zombies, but facing off against apparition-like figures, while another saw him fighting possessed dolls. Finally, Shinji Mikami stepped in once again and took on directing duties to get development back on track.
Hi, I'm Shinji Mikami. Recent rumors would suggest I have been fired, but I assure you, I am still happily working at Capcom. Most unfortunately, I am unable to attend E3 this year because I am so busy working hard on Resident Evil 4.
When Resident Evil 4 hit shelves in early 2005, people quickly found out that this was not the same slow-moving zombie fest like the previous games. In the very first scene, the game showed right away just how different it was than any other Resident Evil before it. You controlled Leon Kennedy, but the infamous tank controls were gone. The game instead featured an over-the-shoulder camera that allowed for greater movement and more precise aiming. The slow, shambling zombies were replaced by villagers that sprinted full speed at you, wielding scythes, axes, and yep, even chainsaws. While this new breed of enemy wasn't classified as a zombie, that did not stop them from being terrifying to deal with. Their improved AI allowed them to chase you up ladders, break through windows and doors, and even dodge your attacks. In short, they were a huge step up from the previous game's zombies and posed a greater challenge than anyone had ever seen in Resident Evil. And with more intelligent and dangerous enemies, it came more powerful weapons. Thanks to the new aiming system, specific areas like the head or legs could be targeted, giving players new ways to disable their foes. Melee attacks were also introduced and now could be performed after stunning an enemy. No need to worry about being cornered or chomped to death when you were a single roundhouse kick away from freeing yourself. Leon was more powerful in close quarters, and naturally it made the game less scary. Yes, these were some astonishing changes that the game had gone through, but many had felt they were changes for the better. I mean, the first time Leon gets his head cut off by the chainsaw guy was a defining moment for most people, and showed that this game was not messing around. Resident Evil 4 garnered multiple Game of the Year awards, with critics praising everything from its graphics to its controls to the voice acting. For once, after the series had spent a good decade scaring players with the survival horror ways, people were embracing this new look. This was the change that they had been hoping for. So, how do you follow up the masterpiece that was Resident Evil 4?
Take over!
Well, Capcom had the idea of keeping the game very action-oriented and hopefully capture that same lightning in the bottle twice. They were convinced that this is what fans wanted. The overwhelmingly positive reaction towards Resident Evil 4 proved that people loved the changes they introduced. So how could reusing that same formula do any wrong? Well, with Resident Evil 5, what we got was a game that was heavy on action, but light on scares. The game took place in Africa in the blistering sun, so gone are the dark, spooky hallways of yore. Maybe the most controversial addition to the game was the two-player co-op, as longtime fans felt that it killed the spirit of the series. Is it still scary when your teammate is loaded up with golden eggs just a few steps away? People didn't really seem to think so. But for the first time, shooting zombies became a shared experience. Whether or not the game was scary, people could not deny that it was fun. By taking all the gameplay elements from Resident Evil 4 and ramping up the intensity, Capcom made the conscious decision to continue modifying the franchise. They turned the game into something that didn't quite feel like Resident Evil in the traditional sense, but it was something that could be appreciated on its own. Pursuing that change with Resident Evil 5 might have been the smartest thing that Capcom could have done with the game, because at that point, there was no way it could have lived up to the expectations that 4 set. 5 may not have been the runaway critical success that 4 was, but it wound up not only being the best-selling Resident Evil game, but also the best-selling Capcom game of all time. Up to that point. Having the game designed around 2 players not only set it apart from Resident Evil 4, but it also propelled it into a category all its own and set the stage for what came next.
It's healing itself.
3 years later, Capcom continued down the action rabbit hole with Resident Evil 6. Long story short, the game wound up being a disappointment for Resident Evil fans as it seemed to try to be too many things at once. Capcom hit the accelerator on almost every facet of the game, incorporating an expanded online co-op, interwoven storylines with every character, and of course the ability to shoot while running. That last point was something that Resident Evil fans had been requesting for well over a decade, and now that it was finally in the game, how did they react? Well, to put it bluntly, people were torn. The game wasn't a complete train wreck. In fact, some moments from the campaigns are as thrilling as anything else the series has done, but it was trying to be so many things at once. It kind of lost sight of what was good about the series. If one thing was clear, it was the Resident Evil that fans knew from the 90s was finally gone. The series was now a shooter, with the only remaining ties to horror being the name on the box. Capcom even went as far as to classify the game as dramatic horror, clearly trying to convince people that it was still the Resident Evil they knew and loved, but the damage had been done. Fans were heartbroken, and most of them believed that they would never see Resident Evil be a true survival horror ever again.
This shit ends now.
Well, that brings us to Resident Evil 7, a game that went back to those horror roots, but did have a little shift in perspective. See, back in 2015, Capcom had a VR demo at E3 called Kitchen, and while it wasn't branded as Resident Evil, it was actually a very sneaky tease of what Resident Evil horror in first person could be. 7 was officially revealed the following year, and it proved to be the shot in the arm that the series needed. As Ethan Winters, the man with no face, and let's face it, no personality, you track your missing wife to a derelict plantation in Louisiana. But there's something not quite right with the Baker family who's living there. Ethan was very different from the capable Leon, Claire, and Chris, and he spends the game stumbling and sneaking around, barely scraping through every encounter. Having a weaker protagonist and the first-person nature meant that every grotesque member of the family was so much more in your face, more dangerous, more intense, more terrifying. And it was even more so if you were brave enough to play the full thing in VR.
Oh my god, what the is that? Jesus Christ!
Resident Evil 7 experimented with its scares. Each boss fight had its own unique angle, and its DLCs pitted you against the Baker family in wildly different scenarios. From playing card games to basically an escape room where you're trying to escape being chained up in bed, Capcom threw a lot of new stuff at the wall, and a lot of it stuck. But while first person was a huge success for them, it doesn't mean they forgot their roots.
That's weird.
2 years later, they remade one of the greats, Resident Evil 2. But in modernizing the game, they removed the infamous static camera in favor of being over the shoulder like Resident Evil 4, pushing lighting and the use of sound in the game to deliver on its scares. The approach to its updated visuals was wetness and darkness, so basically play with light and make it gross. Excellent. It set the gold standard for how a game should be remade. It sold over 15 million copies and was even nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards. So Capcom obviously followed up with Resident Evil 3 the following year. Which was, well, it was fine. Or not fine, really, depending on who you ask. It looks great, plays great, but it lacked some infamous parts of the original, like the clock tower, and it was decidedly lacking in replay value. It did come with an asymmetrical multiplayer mode though. Resident Evil Resistance was made by Neobards, and hey, that team went on to make the excellent Silent Hill F, and it would pit 4 survivors against 1 mastermind player who would spawn enemies and traps to take everyone out. It did not set the world on fire, and it was shut down in 6 months.
Starting to go a little stale.
With Resident Evil 7 moving away from traditional zombies and into the realm of mold, Resident Evil Village also experimented with different ghoulish monsters like werewolves, vampires, and giant babies? Each area of Village felt unique and tapped into different elements of Resident Evil's past. Lady Dimitrescu felt akin to Mr. X, stalking you around her giant mansion. There was the infamous House Beneviento, which tapped into the series' love of puzzles. And thanks to some convenient military training for Ethan Winters, there were a bunch of action-focused sequences thrown in too. Village was also more open than previous installments, and the developers wanted players to explore rather than be funneled through the story. It also had a multiplayer mode called Reverse that no one played or liked. Regardless, Village sold tremendously well, and while not all of it hit, Lady D sure did. She became something of a new mascot for Resident Evil, despite not actually being in the game all that much. Next up on the remake list, just a little game widely considered to be one of the best of all time, Resident Evil 4. And despite the team feeling trepidation about tackling the project, it massively paid off. With the directors of Resident Evil 2 Remake at the helm, Capcom made careful changes to Resident Evil 4. Characters were given extra screen time to give them more depth, gameplay was tweaked, and quality of life changes introduced to make it feel even better to play. The remake respects the original game, all the while elevating it to become the definitive version. If you haven't played it, stop what you're doing and go do it right now. Which brings us to Resident Evil Requiem, which looks to be once again cherry-picking from Resident Evil's past to define its future. Battle-hardened Leon Kennedy is joined by newbie FBI agent Grace Ashcroft, with the dual protagonists providing an ebb and flow between tense stealth and tight resource management, with cathartic all-out action. Capcom loves to try new things. Even the small spin-off games speak volumes about the company's tendency to experiment with the franchise. People might point to a game like Resident Evil 5 and say, oh, this doesn't look like a Resident Evil game to me, but I'm not entirely convinced that a single game can define the series. The true definition of Resident Evil is as fluid as the brains leaking out of a zombie's head. So to answer the question, what is a Resident Evil game? Well, it's survival horror, it's dramatic horror, it's first-person horror, it's third-person action, it's campy dialogue, it's boulder punching, it's change, it's evolution, it's de-evolution, and to me, it's all of those things. Resident Evil might never be the same game that it was in 1996, but that's okay, because much like the game's own T-virus, it's constantly morphing and mutating. So instead of trying to figure out what a real Resident Evil game is, all you need to do is look back on its history, and you'll see that a Resident Evil game is everything the series has been, and everything the series will become. We'll have more on Resident Evil Requiem, so make sure to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. Special shout out to Joey Yee, who originally wrote this video 9 years ago, and to Kurt Indovina for helping me update it, and of course Richard Lee for his incredible edit that you just enjoyed. Okay, thanks, bye.